The United States has appealed to Sri Lanka's politicians to act promptly to resolve their country's economic crisis. An announcement that the Sri Lankan president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, would step down on Wednesday came after protesters seized his official residence and set the Prime Minister's home on fire. Now, the country is dealing with rampant inflation and food, fuel and medicine imports are drying up, as Mark Lebel reports.
Burning fury for all to see. The Sri Lankan Prime Minister's house set alight. Flames fuelled by protesters' anger at economic mismanagement that's left many suffering.
It's become the norm now to see people staying and sleeping in vehicles to get fuel, and that ranges from 3 to 4 days sometimes. Many actually walked for hours to get to the protest sites.
The president's office was also stormed. There was an impromptu pool party at the palace. It's rumoured the president's taken to the high waters as his country finds itself politically and economically all at sea.
It's time that we got all our stolen money back to this country. And also the air conditions are running in that presidential palace while people don't have electricity in their homes.
It's a far cry from the once blossoming tourist hotspot, a country of 22 million people recovering from a brutal civil war, which has been ruled by the Rajapaksa brothers for years.
They embodied three things that have brought Sri Lanka down. The first is authoritarianism, the second is corruption, and the third is ethnic chauvinism.
Now, foreign currencies running dry, hampering imports of food, fuel and medicine, and forcing schools to close. At the beginning of April, angry protests prompted a state of emergency. 12 days later, the government could not pay its foreign debt for the first time in its history. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned in May. A month on, the UN warned of a humanitarian emergency. Now, with the storming of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's home, Parliament Speaker has this message from the President.
He asked me to tell the country that he will resign on the 13th of July, on Wednesday, to ensure a peaceful handover of power. Therefore, there's no need to destabilise the country any longer.
These protests have achieved the resignations of both the Prime Minister and President. But whoever takes over will inherit a humanitarian and law and order crisis, as they are urged to restore stability quickly by the United States and the IMF, so that talks on an economic bailout package can resume. Mark Lebel, BBC News.
Well, we can go live to Colombo now and join our South Asia editor, Ambarasa Nitharajan. And you are at the presidential offices there, still huge crowds. We can see them behind you. Extraordinary scenes, weren't there, over the weekend? Protesters in the pool there, we saw that. What is going on there right now?
These are extraordinary times for Sri Lanka. Just behind me is the president's office, and 24 hours ago, hundreds of people stormed the building. This was one of the most protected buildings here in Sri Lanka. I remember you can't even come near this road during the civil war. Now, the families, men, women, people who took part in the anti-government protests since April, they are coming here, taking pictures to remember this moment. And I was speaking with many of these visitors here, and they say, this is a great occasion for Sri Lanka because people's power has won. Now we have forced these two leaders, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. They've agreed to resign, and that is a great victory for us and the victory for the people of Sri Lanka. That's why you can see the children, men, women, they have been celebrating this occasion, and most of these officials were in the building. They're not there, even though we saw a group of soldiers behind those stairs. But Sri Lanka is now waking up to the new reality where they believe that they can have a government without the Rajapaksa brothers.
And a victory for people power, as you say. But just talk us through the grievances of those people there behind you. What has driven them to this point? What has made them so angry?
So Sri Lanka is one of the developed countries, if you want to describe, in South Asia. The quality of life used to be higher than countries like India or Bangladesh. Now, the people here, many of them, they've stood in queues outside petrol stations for days to get petrol or diesel, which means they cannot travel anywhere. Many of the auto rickshaw drivers, they've lost their income because there is no diesel, and food prices have escalated. The inflation last month was about 55%. That was hyperinflation. And for example, the milk powder prices have tripled in the last 6 months. So cooking gas cylinders are not available, meaning people are struggling to cook at home, and people have lost jobs. And people can't even go to the hospital if they are sick because there are no vehicles to take them. Many doctors are not going to the hospital. They're struggling. Health workers are struggling. Even though the government says health workers can get fuel, they are not able to get into hospital. So we have not realized the real social impact of this economic crisis for the last 3 months. But this itself is a warning to many other developing countries who want to borrow money for infrastructure projects. But if they are not enough to repay this debt, they will meet the same fate as Sri Lanka.
And those people there behind you, are they confident that things will change, that their lives will now change for the better?
That's exactly what I asked one of the women who took part in the protest here. She said, no, our first aim was to drive the Rajapaksa brothers, who have dominated Sri Lankan politics for 20 years now. His elder brother was the president 2 terms and he was prime minister before. And we wanted, because the family was responsible for this economic crisis, and there are lots of allegations against them, and that's why our first aim is to drive the Rajapaksa brothers away and the government away. We've lost faith in this political system. All the political parties representing parliament, they're not really concerned about the people. But we do accept that the economic situation is not going to change overnight. It is going to be a difficult recovery period. International community will have to come in and help, and that's why the UN was warning that it is an impending humanitarian emergency, and people are aware. But for the moment, the first step, what they have been campaigning for, they say they have achieved.
Anne Braston, Ethrajan, our South Asia editor, many thanks indeed for talking to us and giving us the very latest there from Colombo. And we can talk more now about the situation in Sri Lanka with Ahilan Karigama, who's a political economist and senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna, and joins us. And I think you were at those protests, those very dramatic protests in Colombo. What drove you to join those protests and demonstrations?
I'm Vice President of the Federation of University Teachers Associations. And at yesterday's protests, all the trade unions, various people's movements, all of us came together. We've been trying to mobilize people over the last 2 months, and particularly the last 2 weeks, for this major struggle yesterday. And it went beyond our expectations. The people, the masses just came in waves and waves. Despite petrol and diesel shortages, they found whatever fuel they could to get on vehicles packed with trucks, and they came, and they even made the trains that had stopped to run, and they came, and their voice was heard. Yesterday was a great day for democracy in Sri Lanka because the people's voice was heard. They've been wanting this regime gone. They've wanted the president and the prime minister to resign, and I think they've been overwhelmingly heard. And now there's the difficult task of trying to rebuild the country and to bring about, first of all, political and economic stability. And that is going to be a challenge in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, well, it certainly is, and more than a challenge. What would you like to see, first of all, in terms of a new government, and secondly, in terms of economic reform that is actually going to change people's lives?
The demand by many organizations like mine is for an interim government, say for 6 months to a year, so that the situation stabilizes politically. And it might well be a minority government because a lot of the parliamentarians have also lost legitimacy. And along with this interim government, to have a people's council represented by people's movements, trade unions, professional associations, to keep a check on the parliament. Along with that, also the abolition of the executive presidency. That was brought about during an authoritarian time about 40 years ago. And we've seen the dangers of so much power centralized in one individual. So in the weeks ahead, the parliament would have to elect a executive president from one of its members, but hopefully that will only be a symbolic president, and we would slowly go back towards a Westminster-style parliament. In the meantime, Sri Lanka is facing severe shortages, not just in fuel, but also in food. We are going through a food crisis. We might be facing a famine in a few months' time. So the food system is important. So the entire priority should be around food. Agricultural production was affected by the president's disastrous policy of banning fertilizers. So increasing agricultural production and ensuring that food gets to the people is going to be a priority. So we need to have a public distribution system. The immediate concern is that we will have to think about economic reforms, but that cannot be brought about now amidst what's looking like a severe economic depression. Our GDP might shrink by as much as 1/10 this year. So it's a very serious situation where people's livelihoods are disrupted, their income streams are dwindling. So giving relief and ensuring that people get food and our next generation doesn't get affected by malnutrition is the priority at the moment.
All right. Ahilan Kadirgama, who is a political economist and professor at the University of Jaffna, took part in those demonstrations. Many thanks indeed for your analysis. Thank you for your time as well. Thank you.